for me, the way I got interested in gars was I had a Ranger Rick magazine when I was a kid that some neighborhood kids gave me. It was a back issue. I didn't have my own subscription. And I flipped to the middle of it and I saw this, fish that looked like an alligator with fins instead of legs. And it was an alligator gar. And that stuck with me all the way to years later. I mean, I studied some other things along the way, but the gars came back, and now that's what I studied, that's what I focus on, to use them as an example for broader freshwater biodiversity. I've had the opportunity to write for Ranger Rick and put an article there, so kind of coming full circle. So I think reaching that younger generation is extremely important, because they're the ones that are going to be around to deal with both the problems that we're making and hopefully the values that we're trying to instill.
Hey there, Podcast Aquanauts. It's your host, Casey here. If you've been listening to this show for very long, you've probably heard us use the phrase living fossil at least a time or two. These are what biologists might call the Dorian Grays of the animal world. Ancient species that have remained relatively unchanged by the passage of time despite existing on Earth for countless millennia. In this episode, we'll be homing in on gar, an order of fishes that definitely have earned their credentials as living fossils, owing to the fact that they first appeared on Earth around the same time as dinosaurs. Gar's many distinctive adaptations and prehistoric appearance have made them beloved by scientists and, increasingly, of online communities thanks to the rise of annual celebrations such as Gar Week, which just so happens to be going on as this episode goes live. Joining us are the aquarium's homegrown fish nerd and former gar papa, Dr. Kuhajda, and Dr. Solomon David, a researcher and professor at the University of Minnesota who has garnered a significant online following through his educational, pun-filled social posts about these toothy fishes. But anyway, that's more than enough from me. Let's get things rolling, shall we? On with the podcast. Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Podcast Aquatic, the official podcast of the Tennessee Aquarium. Today, I want to talk about living fossils, and living fossils of a very particular sort. In this case, we have a couple of special guests on the show who I'm about to introduce, but this is going to be a very garless discussion about the group of fishes known as gar. And we are very lucky to have on the show today a special guest, Dr. Solomon David, who is, if you are at all interested in gar or have maybe you've just seen him on social media, pretty much the gar expert on social media. Dr. David, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
And then representing the aquarium, in addition to me, is Dr. Kuhajda, the aquatic conservation biologist at the Tennessee Aquarium Conservation Institute. And you've been on a couple of episodes with us so far.
I have, yeah. I run the whole gamut of fishes, and I always have a story to tell.
You do. And the last time you were on the show, I was actually talking about a different living fossil, a sturgeon, the Cyrdaria shovelnose sturgeon, and the quest that you went on to try and find it and figure out whether or not it was still around back earlier. That was earlier this year, wasn't it?
It was, and we did get a couple of positive eDNA hits, so environmental DNA hits, so it might still be lurking out there.
Oh, very cool. I hadn't talked to you since apparently that news arrived. So, and then obviously I should introduce myself. I'm Casey Phillips, the host of the show, and they're very much not an expert on gar or sturgeons. So hopefully these two scientists can get me over the hump and make sure that I don't trip over myself. But let's start with getting some background on each of you. Bernie, we've already covered the fact that you're an aquatic conservation biologist at Tennessee, but Dr. David, you're an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, an aquatic ecologist, and the principal investigator at the university's GarLab. Which obviously that ties pretty nicely into today's topic. Can you give us kind of a brief overview about the GarLab, what it is, when it started, and what some of its focal points are when it comes to research?
Yeah. Well, as the name indicates, GarLab studies gars, but I like to think that we've expanded, kind of like, well, you all are down south, but I look at it as like as the Big Ten conference has expanded to it's no longer Big Ten. GarLab isn't just gars anymore, and so we work on both and other living fossil species, other non-game native fish, which are sometimes called rough fish, sometimes more unfortunately called trash fish, and those underappreciated species. So we like to look at those sort of underappreciated native non-game species and recognize that they have this sort of multifaceted value for understanding ecology, evolution, and also natural resource management. So we want to look at how those patterns of those fish's life history and evolution can kind of inform our management of natural resources and also conservation of freshwater biodiversity.
Bernie, normally you're talking about much smaller fish than I think most gar tend to be. But you actually, as far as I know, are the only person I've ever met who had a pet gar. Although maybe Dr. David, you have a pet gar as well. I don't know. But what can you tell us about Clyde Garfield Kuhajda?
Ah, yes. Good old Clyde. I had a pet alligator gar in an 80-gallon tank for 8 years. Um, we went down to Auburn University where they were raising gar in a hatchery there, and we were able to get two specimens. One was a bunch of photos were taken. It was preserved for Joe Tomalleri to illustrate a juvenile alligator gar for the Fishes of Alabama book. And the second one came home with me. And yeah, Clyde lived in my living room. We had Molly the black cat, and Molly would sit on the edge of the couch, and Clyde would go to that side of the tank, and they'd stare at each other. It was a stare off all the time. Um, at parties, we would have feeding time for Clyde, and it was typically minnows or mosquito fish. But I once had a couple special guests, Larry Page, who wrote the Handbook of Darters, and Brooks Burr, who's a co-author with him on the Peterson Field Guide to North American Fishes. And I fed Clyde darters. And instead of going horizontal and going sideways motion to catch fish like they do with those mid-column or upper column water fishes, Clyde pointed his nose to the bottom and went sideways and got the darters off the bottom. So he actually altered his normal feeding behavior just for those darters.
Wow. Dr. David, does that surprise you to hear that Clyde behaved in such a fashion?
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, what doesn't surprise me is that GARs are, never cease to surprise us. So that might sound kind of paradoxical, but I think, a theme with GARs and a lot of these other underappreciated native fishes is that they're severely understudied. So there's a lot we know about largemouth bass and rainbow trout and walleye, especially up here in Minnesota. I like to say we're about 100 years behind what we know about a lot of other game fish than what we know about GARs. So there's a lot about their natural history and behavior that we don't know that seems unusual and surprising to us as humans, but GARs have been doing this for 150 million years plus. And so it's funny that you mention a lot of things there, Bernie, because I think we've got some good parallels there. I did recently feed a young of the year long-nosed gar, a tiny darter, because we needed a slim profiled fish that it could eat just to get it over the hump of some growth. Sure enough, it actually went down and came up alongside it and then did its side swipe thing. And of course, the darter's a good elongate fish, so that kind of worked well. And what we've also found over the past maybe 5-10 years is that gars actually do create suction with their mouths. So when they open up their mouths, they create, a small amount of suction they can use to actually bring that prey item in closer. And then, of course, those long jaws and sharp teeth help grasp the prey and bring them in. Because for a long time, it's thought that their bony skulls were very fused with all those bones, not as flexible as something like a bass that, opens that huge mouth and sucks in the prey. So they've got these interesting adaptations that, we're just now finding out about them because people like Bernie and myself and collaborators are paying a bit more attention to what these fish are doing. And things like observing them in aquariums can show you so much more than, let's say, just getting them in a net or electrofishing them. I think you need all parts of that type of research or investigation to put together the overall picture. So I think that aquarium observation is extremely important for understanding their natural history as well.
What I should probably do, and I feel like I do this every episode, I end up having to sound the backup alert because what we haven't really done is talk about what a gar is. And that's my fault. But once you've seen them, you're like, they're so distinctive looking that they're kind of hard not to recognize. But could one of you just kind of, and I guess probably Dr. David, it makes more sense to ask you, could you just provide a quick summation of some of the distinctive features that make gar distinct from other groups of fishes?
Sure. And I'm happy to hear any add-ons that Bernie has to my basic description that I, share with people when they say, like, can you describe a gar? I tell them to imagine an alligator with fins instead of legs, and then maybe take that alligator tail and turn that into a paddle. And you've basically got a gar at that point. So you've got this big, sort of heavily armored, armored bodied fish with those fins instead of the legs, but you got that those long jaws with lots of teeth. Those teeth are meant for grasping and holding prey. They don't have the power like a bite of an alligator or a crocodile or even a bowfin, but they're really good at holding onto that prey and then adjusting that prey to typically swallow that head first. But that's sort of the physical description of them. But they've got all these cool adaptations, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But that's my typical one: alligator with fins instead of legs. But Bernie, if you've got anything to add to that, I'm curious to what you got too.
Well, just like alligators quite often will lurk near the surface, it's the same way with gar. That's why a lot of people have seen them either canoeing or fishing or even just walking along a river or a lake. They tend to hang out near the surface, and they're big. I mean, long-nosed gar can get 5 feet long, alligator gar 10 feet long, and they're just big, cool looking, slightly scary fishes that really do draw your attention.
You mentioned kayaking. That's the only time I think I ever saw a gar prior to when you and I were out at the Sequatchie River, this west of downtown, right?
Yes.
You were just, I think, seining the river just to see what was there, and I think you pulled up a gar for the first. I saw one for the first time in the wild. We obviously have them here at the aquarium, and we'll get into that a little bit later, which species we have. But yeah, they're from above at least. Their profile is just so distinctive, and they do have, like you said, some of those characteristics do make them pretty intimidating. But you said they're towards the top of the water column. What kinds of aquatic habitats are they in? What kind of water do they like? Do they like slower moving water, fast moving water? Does it need to be deep? What kinds of aquatic habitats can you find them in?
Well, Casey, really quick, before going into habitats, I did want to say, yes, gars look intimidating. You'll oftentimes see, like, the river monsters pictures or whatever, especially with the business end with, the long jaws, lots of teeth. But I do, recommend to people, if you see the gar, it's usually from that side profile or like kind of with the mouth open. If you look at a gar head on, like straight on with the mouth closed, you're going to look at one of the derpiest Muppet looking fish that you'll see. So the intimidation factor, I feel, is relative. So when people go to the aquarium, or if you look them up online, look for like the head on, sort of like you're face to face with them, and it's like all snout, and you got these like googly eyes off to the side. So I think it's a matter of perspective when you're thinking about scary or ferocious versus, to the fish, it's just a fish. So I figured I want to add in that about like look at them head on, and you'll see the derpiness
It's a
to
very
them and
boopable
stuff.
snoot.
Yes, the very boopable snoot. But getting at your habitat, as Bernie described, I think that can vary because you've got 7 extant species of gars, and they actually, can cover a wide range of habitats. As Bernie said, they typically will be at the surface. At least that's when people usually see them, because we don't spend as much time underwater as we do above water. And gars have adaptations which allow them to breathe air. So they've got a lung-like gas bladder that works like a scuba tank. So when you see them at the surface, oftentimes they're going to be opening up their jaws, taking a gulp of air. They kind of exhale through the back of the gills to remove that deoxygenated air. And of course, they have to do that at the surface. And on a warm day, that's usually where they're going to be hanging out. But gars can be in the bottom of the water column as well. Alligator gars in Texas like to be in the mid water, sometimes at the bottom. They like feeding off of the bottom as well. Gars also have a tolerance for salt water. So if you were to go to the New Orleans aquarium, the Audubon Aquarium in New Orleans, they've got a couple alligator gars in full salt water with sand tiger sharks, sea turtles. Long-nosed gars can survive in salt water as well. So they've got a lot of cool adaptations that allow them to live in a lot of different places, from streams to rivers to backwaters. So that's kind of they're a well adapted organism or group of organisms, and they've been doing this for a very long time. And Bernie, happy to hear what you have to add to that too.
Well, first of all, Solomon, I wanted to know, does the Cuban gar get into salt water a little bit?
They are tolerant of salt water. Basically, what we found is all gars are tolerant of salt water to some extent. Short noses seem to have the lowest saltwater tolerance, but they found Florida gars off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. Cuban gars, of course, being mainly on Cuba and the Isle of Youth. So they're already kind of this sort of island-ish or coastal species. So they do have this high tolerance. And alligator gars, they catch them in full-on saltwater. They all do need, like sturgeon, freshwater to reproduce. So they do lay their eggs in freshwater, but a lot of them can live in coastal environments.
Well, that is great. So now I can say that there is such a thing as a Cuban cigar.
Oh my God.
It's a required gar pun. You have to make it, Casey. You should have seen that coming, but
I feel ashamed that I did not actually see that coming.
we both set him up. We both set him up for that.
Oh,
Yes,
my
we
gosh.
did.
Shame on both of us.
Okay, so given that there are only 7, you said extant, so that means that there's currently living only 7 species of gar. Can you just go ahead and do a quick rundown of the 7 extant species of gar so that we can get that out of the way so people know which ones to look for?
Right. So there's 2 genera of gars. There's Lepisosteus and Atractosteus. And if we get into it a little bit later, they split. Those 2 genera split over 100 million years ago. So they separated from each other quite a while ago. The extant species of gars are only about 2.5 to 5 million years old. And I say only with a relative sort of tagline to it, because that's pretty old for a given species. So if we look at Atractosteus, that's what has sort of the flagship gar that most people know who know gars, which is the alligator gar. And then its 2 closest relatives, the Cuban gar and the tropical gar. And all of the members of that genus have shorter, broader snouts. The Lepisosteus gars is comprised of 4 different species. They all have narrower and longer snouts. The one that has the most sort of probably standout snout would be the long-nosed gar, which Ali Ward called it the most redundantly named gar because, gars by definition seem to have long snouts. If you're saying it has a long, long snout, what does that even mean? And then there's the short-nosed gar, which actually doesn't have the shortest nose of any gar. And then there's the spotted gar and the Florida gar, which are very 2 similar-looking species with short snouts, lots of spots. And we're still now parsing apart, are they, closely related species? Could some of them that we thought were different be the same species? Are there hidden species? Again, with these being very understudied, like a lot of species out where you all are in Tennessee, we might be looking at some cryptic diversity with these understudied species as well.
Yeah, Bernie, I guess to loop you into this, it's to people who are outside of the realm of science, they might not realize that you can sometimes, like a species can kind of split, right? So a species that you don't know as much about once you start looking at it a little more closely. And this happened fairly recently to you in northern Alabama with 2 species that you thought were one that became 2, right? You did some studies and genetically they were distinct from each other, even though they were thought to be the same species.
This happens all the time. The North American freshwater fishes are the most well-studied, well-understood group of fishes on a continent, but we're still describing new species. And very seldom, if ever, in the last 40 years has it been, we found this fish no one's ever seen before. It's just you have a wide-ranging species that you call species X, and then you look more closely with genetics or morphology or both, and you wait a minute, this is really 5 different species, and it's packaged in these distinct watersheds. Several years ago, what we thought was one species, the bowfin, has now been broken up into 3 species, I believe. 4?
Two officially.
2 officially, maybe 3. So, as Solomon has said, these older fishes, we've sort of overlooked them, and we're looking at the more diverse, more advanced groups like minnows and darters and little mad tom catfishes, and those are the things that tend to get split up and named new species, but there may be this hidden diversity in some of these living fossils.
So you mentioned old, and you just said the word living fossils. When we talk about the fossil record, when do gar first put in an appearance?
Sure, and that's kind of relative, how far back you look when they split from their closest relatives and that sort of thing. But if you look at the modern family of gars, which is Lepisosteidae, we can now date that back to about 157 million years ago. So that's late Jurassic period. So I like to say they're older than Tyrannosaurus Rex, and they outlasted it too. So dates really far back. And if you look at those early fossil gars, they look very, very similar to the modern day gars that we see today. So you can look at a fossil gar gar from, any of the museums. The Green River Formation has a lot of gars in it. But you look at that fossil gar, it looks very similar to those gars you're going to see in the aquarium, that you see in the literature, that you might see out in the wild. They've kind of found this body plan of these armored ganoid scales, the air breathing, the elongate jaws, the adaptability to various habitats. They found this plan that worked, and they've basically stuck with it for a really long time. And research that we published with colleagues a couple of years ago showed that gars actually have the slowest rates of molecular evolution of any jawed vertebrate. So if you get past hagfish and lamprey, any vertebrate that has a jaw, the gars are evolving at a slower rate than any of those other ones. Chimeras, coelacanths, lungfish, sturgeons. Sturgeons were the second closest. So they've been doing this for a long time, and they really haven't changed a whole lot. So to Bernie's point about the cryptic diversity, it's kind of relative, right? We think these species split over time, but what might be a small change in gars, might take a lot of time, may not seem like a very big change to us. So I think to back up what Bernie was saying, there's this cryptic diversity that could be out there with these living fossils that is just yet to be discovered.
Does that make it less interesting to study gar, not knowing that there is less likelihood maybe of there being some surprise species waiting out there for you to discover? I mean, with minnows, like Bernie said, and darters, the next year there could be 3 or 4 new species. Is that not having that possibility, is that disappointing to you as a researcher?
Right. No, that's a great question. But, Casey, I've made my career so far mainly on focusing on gars. So I feel like I've been able to carve out a little bit, not worrying about the new species.
That's fair.
To me, I think it's exciting, that there's the possibility of those other species, because we only have 7 that have been described. But because they're so understudied, what we're finding out about their ecology, their behavior, like Bernie described with the gar and the darter, there's so much that we don't know just with the few species we have, that's going to keep us busy for a while. And that doesn't even get into like the natural resource management and conservation of these underappreciated fish. So I think there's a lot left to discover about these fish. And as Bernie mentioned about the bowfin, I was on one of the 2 papers that, split that species into 2. And so I think that sets, a good stage for looking at these other living fossil fishes. So I think there's plenty more to look at. So I'm excited about the possibility, even though I might have to wait a really long time for that to happen.
Sure.
But these fish are so cool, Casey. It doesn't matter if there's never a new species. Like Solomon said, there's so much we don't know about their early life history, life history as adults. So, I am a minnow guy, I am a darter guy, and we go out and we seine, and people say, "Oh, that's cool. Oh, that's cool." Then we get a gar in the net, and people lose their minds. The only thing that trumps a gar is a turtle, and people just every person wants their photo with the gar, and they want to be seen kissing the gar, but not really, because it does have teeth. And so they're just exciting animals. They really are. They just pique the interest of everyone that sees them. And if you get to hold them, you understand how powerful they are, how those enamel covered ganoid scales feel different from any other fish you're going to pick up. There's always the threat of those teeth getting you, so there's a little danger element there, and they're just really fun.
The Tennessee Aquarium's Podcast Aquatic is made possible by support from the Tennessee Conservationist, the official magazine of Tennessee state parks. Each issue is filled with fascinating stories about Tennessee's native species, rich history, and unique culture. It's also your guide to exploring state parks and planning your next outdoor adventure. Subscribe today at tnconservationist.org. So what does a gar bite feel like? Have you been nipped before?
Not yet.
I'll let Bernie take that fast. Okay, I was going to say, okay, go ahead first. I've probably, handled thousands of gars of various life stages. Because, if we put it just young of the years, that's a lot of little guys. It's kind of like their teeth are made for grasping and holding. So they're very sharp and they're very pointed. So they're not going to like bite your finger off or anything, but they will break the skin pretty easily. But it's nothing, you might get a little bit of a, it's like a pinprick sort of thing. I've probably been bitten by 2 gars in my entire time working with gars. And that's like everything from like 7.5 foot long alligator gars down to like, well, newly hatched gars don't really have the teeth on them. So if anything, it's the tails that tend to get me. So they've got these very reinforced rays on their tails. Some of these non-teleos fish, what we call like the sort of non-modern fishes, have these very reinforced bony fin rays that connect with bone skeletal supports on the interior. So they tend to be a lot stronger than what you might see in like bass or minnows or darters. So those have kind of like slashed back and forth, and you get some scrapes that way. So it's not the end you might think of that is the more hectic end to be wary of with the gars. You always want to watch for the teeth, but I would say they're not out to bite you or anything like that. Usually, people get bitten by a gar, it's because they're trying to handle the snout or maybe unhook something, but they're not coming after people. They're not going to actually try to bite you. And if you do get bitten, it's not the end of the world.
Well, to Bernie's point earlier, I mentioned that we were on the Sequatchie River and that gar came up in the net, and it did. I mean, the only thing that trumped that gar showing up in that net was, in fact, a baby turtle, and it did. It just shut down all activity for a good 20 minutes, it felt like, while everyone had to get their picture taken, like you said. So, yeah, I say that tongue very firmly in cheek about, are you disappointed about there not being the possibility of there being enough to learn about gar? Because clearly there's so much to learn. And I wanted to circle back to that, though, because you say that we know so little about gar compared to a lot of these other fish, like you mentioned, largemouth bass and smallmouth bass and pike and those others. And the thread that seems to tie those together is that those are game fish, right? So is that the root of why we know so little about them? Are gar just not seen as, they're not studied because they aren't seen as useful to humans in the sense that they're not a target for anglers, or what's the reason behind why we know so little about them?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different reasons, or there's probably several reasons, but I think you hit on two. So one of them is, yes, we know a lot about the game fish because that's where the money is, right? People want to go out and they want to fish for bass, they want to fish for rainbow trout. Those are two of the most broadly stocked species of fish in the world, let alone the United States. So, we've done analyses on this and looked at like, the number of scientific publications by the American Fisheries Society on game versus non-game fish. So bass and rainbow trout, there's 11 times more papers on them just by American Fisheries Society than something like the blue sucker or the long-nosed gar or the white sucker. So because that's where the management funding is, people are buying fishing license to go after these fish, and then it takes one more step in the negative direction. Not only do people typically not want to fish for these fish as much, relatively speaking, but they've got this bad reputation of like, well, the gars are bad for the game fish. They're eating all the baby bass, they're eating the crappie. They're these predatory fish with this menacing look, so they've got to be bad, right? And the science has not supported that. It shows that they're going to eat whatever's most abundant. Sometimes it might be panfish, sometimes it's usually like minnows and gizzard shad. They love eating shad, but it's usually forage fish populations. And like any other predator, they help maintain balance in the ecosystem. And that's what we're trying to show, is the value that these fish have to broader freshwater biodiversity, maintaining balance in ecosystems. But they've got this bad rap. So, it's kind of like it used to be up until the 1980s. I think it was in Iowa. It was illegal if you caught a gar on hook and line to return it back to the water alive. You had to break its back or break its snout and throw it back dead. And this is the 80s. Like, I was alive during the 80s. I mean, it's so we've come a long way. I think there's still a lot of work left to be done. But to get at your question, there's that game fish sort of popularity aspect, and then there's the non-game fish, and even some of these that are looked at in a negative light.
So it's like the shark conundrum, right?
Right.
So,
right.
wow, I had no idea that they had that reputation. I mean, I know, again, we talked about the fact that they've got this menacing appearance, and even with that menacing appearance, I've never personally been intimidated by them, though I see how they could cause feelings of maybe nervousness. And having my hand in the water of our River Giants exhibit here at the aquarium to film underwater, I don't have a scuba certification, but I can shove my hand down in the exhibit with a phone. And they I've a few times had to yank my hand out of the water when a gar, probably just out of sheer inquisitiveness, came up to investigate what it was going on, what was at the top of the water column, but never really seriously scared of them. Are gar naturally curious? We talk often, or we have talked on this show before, about fish being more intelligent than maybe people assume. Have you seen evidence of gar behaving in a way that would indicate that they are more intelligent than people might think they would be?
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit about that, and I want to give Bernie a chance to weigh in on that. But yeah, I would say like they're fish in general are smarter than we give them credit for. Like that whole, memory of a goldfish thing, that doesn't even hold any water. No pun intended. Is that a fish pun or a water pun? Anyway, I think they are smarter. They can recognize individuals. They're very curious. They know when food's coming. They can recognize individual people. I've had pets, so I have had pet gars. I actually have a bunch right now. The oldest is 16 years old. It's actually from my graduate research I did at University of Michigan. And we've got a bunch in the lab as well. But they will recognize individuals. They'll associate you with, food or other things. Some people have trained them where they can actually, pet them. Not that I recommend it, but so yeah, I would say they're much smarter than we think, and they're very curious. They aren't coming after you. And I'll stop there so I can pivot to my colleague here.
I agree. And we just had a behavior spend over a year with this graduate student from the University of Georgia, and he was studying behavior in minnows. And, minnows play in the little bubbles from an air stone. And so I think fish do a lot more. They have a lot more personalities, and they're way more intelligent than we have historically given them credit for. And that includes the ancient fishes and the more advanced fishes.
So speaking of ancient fishes, Bernie, we were talking before the podcast got started that you said you would just kind of sit in the background and let Dr. David be the king of the episode, and that you'd be there for comic relief. But I do see a lot of parallels, and I mentioned them earlier to you that you work with species that are fairly similar. We mentioned that you work with darters and minnows, but a lot of your work also has dealt with sturgeon, which I brought up earlier that you were in Central Asia looking for the Cyrdaria shovel-nosed sturgeon. Do you hear a lot of parallels that you can kind of nod your head along to as Dr. David's talking about gar? Are you hearing similarities in terms of what we know about sturgeon and what's known about gar, or are sturgeon better understood? Do you hear a lot of similarities in what Dr. David is saying and work you've done with sturgeon?
Solomon's already addressed this, that, the slowest molecular evolution is in gar and the second slowest is in sturgeon. So, yeah, we may have something that's the same species with no perceived variation across its range, but it may have been that same way for 10 million years, and the same way, the reason the Tennessee Aquarium and all of its partners are putting lake sturgeon back in the Tennessee River system, and our partners as well in the Cumberland and Coosa River systems, is because that's part of the aquatic ecosystem that has disappeared in the 1970s, and we are trying to restore balance to the ecosystem. And it's the same way in Western Tennessee. The state is starting to reintroduce alligator gar back in around Memphis, because historically they were there, and now they're a missing component of that natural ecosystem, and so we're trying to get it back. And these the same way as alligator gar can live 50 years, they can have 500,000 eggs. Lake sturgeon can live over 100 years, and they can have 1,000,000 eggs. So there's a lot of parallels with these ancient fishes. They do a lot of the same things. Long lives, slow evolution. They're sort of chilled fish, and they're fascinating.
When you say chilled, what do you mean?
The only way you can be a fish and live 50 years, be a sturgeon, live over 100 years, is you can't be excited all the time, right? You gotta, little minnows and darters, they're always looking over their shoulder for who's going to eat them. They're zipping around here, there, and everywhere. They're little nervous Nellies. But these more ancient fish, they get big sizes, so they don't have to worry about predators. They slow metabolism, low rates of evolution, and they just got life figured out. They know how not to get stressed and caught up in the latest social media craze. They just know how to chill. I mean, you couldn't put another fish in a tank like we have in our Ridges to Rivers exhibit for lake sturgeon and not have the fish lose their mind being touched by 300 people, 3,000 people in a day. But lake sturgeon can do that. And I'm sure if gar were more pettable, gar would be the same way. They just got life figured out. So we need to be more like sturgeon and gar.
That's excellent, excellent advice.
I like it. I like it. Yeah, that's we got to put that on a t-shirt. We need to be more like sturgeon and gars there. So, and I think, yeah, you could do a gar touch tank. I think there'd have to be waivers associated with it. So maybe, we can pitch the idea and see, but probably a little bit too much of a liability, but they do like to jump, I think, a bit more than sturgeon do. So, which, to their credit, if they did jump, they can survive for a while out of water because they can breathe air. So, I mean, when we work with alligator gars down south, we'll put them onto the boat and drive them over to shore so we can tag them and take our measurements. And they're way more chill with doing that because they can breathe air. We just put a wet towel over their eyes to keep them calm. And they can breathe air and then we can get our measurements and get them back in. Whereas with a lot more sensitive fish, we can't do that. And so they do have some, pretty neat adaptations. Not to digress too much, but with that dinosaur, like ancient fishes thing, I gave a brief talk at a paleontology conference a couple of years ago, and I don't know anything about paleontology that much, not to my colleagues that were there, but I did a lineup of like Alan Grant on the Triceratops, stomach when it was breathing and stuff, and I had a similar one of me with the alligator gar, because when you get them up on land, they do this big heaving when they let out that air from their gas bladder. So it's almost like a big bellowing burp. But from a fish that's like 7.5 feet long, I mean, that's pretty impressive and stuff. So I think they've got, again, these cool adaptations that have let them be chill for a very long period of time. I will also say sturgeon are popular, commercially speaking, because of their eggs and the caviar. We can't do the same thing with gars because gar eggs are toxic to birds, mammals, and most invertebrates, arthropods. So we can't have a caviar, garviar industry or anything like that. But so there are some divergences in the as cool as sturgeon are, we can't do all the same things with gars.
How did we find out that gar eggs are toxic? Did somebody try to have caviar on the wrong dish or from the wrong fish?
Yeah, and you would think that like once somebody did that, word would get around, but every couple years it comes back up that somebody tried to eat gar caviar and they got violently ill. I want to say it was 2 or 3 years ago. Some people went to the hospital. Nobody has died from it, but they just have a very, very bad day. And so yeah, it's toxic, but it's not toxic to other fish, which I think comes back to that value of these fish. So gar eggs are not toxic to fish, and so there's video footage I've seen of Lake Erie where longnose gars are spawning, and you got these giant bluegill just there scarfing down the eggs as they're being laid. So in turn, gars will help control sometimes game fish and other forage fish populations, prevent stunting in panfish, because bluegill and pumpkin seed, those fish in a lot of the ponds and lakes can quickly overpopulate and get to stunted, smaller fish, which no one wants to catch a stunted fish. So gars help regulate that, but there's that whole circle of life situation where as those eggs are being laid, those panfish are coming around and eating up those eggs as well. So there's a lot of parallels and connections in the ecosystem there.
Hey, when you're talking about laying eggs, we need to talk about the adaptation that the yolk sac larvae have because it's pretty cool. Go for it.
Yeah. So as Bernie's alluding to, so the yolk sac larvae have a sectorial disc around the nose that allows them to stick to the vegetation. So that way they just kind of hang out there. They look like almost like vertical tadpoles. And, they're in the shallow water in the vegetation, usually low oxygen, which is why we think that ichthyotoxin, the gar egg toxin, has evolved to work against mammals and birds and arthropods, because that's typically what we're going to find in low oxygen waters. You typically aren't going to find like a bass or, other predatory fish because they usually like to have, water that's highly, at least a little bit more oxygen. And what we've also found is that those little larval gars are also toxic for a short period of time. So as they develop, that toxicity kind of breaks down. But we think it's something they pull from the egg, and as they develop, they've got that yolk sac. It's probably in there. So they are protected for a little bit because the parents don't provide any protection to gars. They lay the eggs and they go off and, to the rest of their lives.
So they're not guarding they're not like cichlids guarding their young then.
And you got to say guarding with the emphasis on the gar there,
I'm missing so many of these obvious puns. I'm so ashamed of myself.
If you miss it, Casey, Bernie and I will pick it up. Don't worry about it.
We got you, Casey.
So you mentioned alligator gar that were 7.5 feet. I think you said 10 feet is the potential size earlier. What does an animal that large eat? I mean,
anything it wants.
I mean, is it just fish? If there's a duck on the top of the water, will they eat a duck?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as Bernie said, they'll eat basically anything they can swallow. So, a 7.5 foot long alligator gar seems very big, and it is. But if you look at the jaws on that, they're only about this big. I'm showing about maybe if you turn a football to its widest, length. That's about the gape limitation. So they can only swallow what they can fit down their throat, or eat what they can swallow, essentially, because they don't have the bite force to tear off chunks like a shark or even like a piranha would. But if they do see a duck, they're going to eat a duck, if they happen to have the craving, I guess, or the opportunity. So they're very opportunistic. They found blue crab in the stomachs. They will eat carp. Several years ago, there's this thing about gar might be the answer to the, invasive carp situation. They're definitely not the answer by any stretch. There's way too many carp. There's way too few gars, but they can eat big fish. We pulled out about a 3 foot long carp from the stomach of an 8 foot long alligator gar. And it was very smelly and mostly digested, but they can eat some pretty big fish, but they're not going to attack humans. You're not a meal to them because, they can't swallow you or anything like that.
And Bernie, we talked about you going to Central Asia to look for sturgeon, and people are probably familiar with the fact that there's sturgeon in Russia. All the gar that are extant are in the Americas, isn't that right?
Yeah, they're in Central America and Mexico, Cuba, and North America up to the Great Lakes and maybe just a little bit beyond. But the fossils are in Africa and South America, Madagascar and India when they probably used to be part of Africa, they got there. And I think there's a few gar fossils over in Europe also. So way back in the day, in the Jurassic and Cretaceous, they were spread out in a lot more of the world than they are today.
So what happens then? Why are they now so limited to the Americas? Do we know? I mean, is that an area that needs to be studied further?
Solomon, have you asked a gar what happened to their ancestors?
Right. It was hard to understand from underwater, and then when they're above water, they're just kind of doing the burping thing. So, that's a great question. And I think there's a couple different theories on like these non-teleost fish like sturgeon and gars and bowfin, which used to have way more species in their families and in their groups compared to now. And it could be with teleost, the more modern fish, the sort of as they diversified, they were able to fill in more diverse niches throughout different habitats. And so maybe the gars and the sturgeons got pushed to, these other more specific niches and stuck with that. There's way more teleost fish. If you look at like the non-sturgeon gar paddlefish groups of ray fin fishes, you've got we're looking at upwards of 30,000 non-tele or of teleost fish, the darters, the minnows, the oarfish, swordfish, compared to like maybe, I don't know, 50 non-teleost fish. So they used to, it's kind of like the dinosaurs. They had their time of domination. And I think now you're looking at these sort of remnant populations. But as we've described, time moves slower for these guys. So maybe they're just waiting out the next big extinction. We as humans are doing a good job of driving ourselves and species to that down that path. But I think they're going to survive. They're able to persist this long. You look at a sturgeon today, you look at ancient sturgeons, they look basically the same. And so I think it's relative to look at maybe those geographic shifts. That seems like a really long time to us, but maybe it's, a drop in the bucket for a gar and sturgeon, type of fish.
Well, I don't want to lean gar too much on the paleontological side of this.
Nice.
Thank
Got
you.
it.
Um, but we have talked about the fact that these animals were around during the Jurassic, the Cretaceous period. That we like to say about sturgeon, the lake sturgeon, that they were swimming around with T Rex. You already mentioned that it's older than T Rex. We don't still have T Rex walking around, but we still have sturgeon swimming around. We still have gar in our lakes and our rivers. Why is that?
I mean, I think that you've got these adaptations, right? So we've kind of it comes down to evolution and adaptation. As Bernie alluded to, they've got these diamond-shaped ganoid scales, which are basically made out of tooth enamel. It's a compound very similar to it. So they're very armored type of scale compared to a trout or compared to a minnow. They can breathe air, so they can live in these or low oxygen environments. They can live in fresh water, salt water. They've got those toxic eggs to protect the young. They can live for a really long time. The oldest alligator gars can live for over 100. Even the smallest gar species, the short-nosed gar, can live to 50. When you've got long life producing lots of, young, even though most of them aren't going to survive, toxicity, this evolution and adaptation to these multiple types of environments have helped. I think what we've said over time, and this goes for a lot of different fish species, is they've evolved and adapted over time and done really well for themselves. Can they survive us as humans when you think about damming and levying their habitats, draining wetlands, the sort of toxic, pollution that's taking place. So I think it's up to us to kind of conserve those habitats in order to conserve these fishes from gars and sturgeons all the way down to the minnows and darters.
Bernie, I saw you nodding your head along with this.
And yeah, I am. And a classic example is the Tennessee River. All those dams on the Tennessee River, as well as water pollution, overfishing, caused the lake sturgeon to disappear. But we used to have shovel-nosed sturgeon in the Tennessee River. They're gone. We used to have short-nosed gar in the Tennessee River. They're gone. They're extirpated from Alabama. They're gone from Alabama. If you do enough alteration to these big river habitats, you lose species, and it seems like these ancient fishes are pretty susceptible to that. I mean, the meteor that caused the extinction of most of the dinosaurs, crocodiles and birds the exception, it did not dam every major river system in the northern hemisphere like humans have done in the last 150 years. And so what a meteor couldn't do, humans have done for impacting these ancient fishes. So it really is all about these large rivers that really natural catastrophes couldn't eliminate all of them all at once. We've done it.
Wow, I'm almost as impressed as I am saddened by that.
I just want to throw out that that is a very impressive analogy and fact. So I will credit Bernie with that when I use that in the future. But thanks for that about the dams versus the meteor.
No problem.
I do want to take a moment to shift things away just a little bit from gar and sturgeon to talking about science communication, because one of the things that for which you are so well known, Dr. David, is you do have this popularity and this following on Instagram and other social media platforms, and you've really done a lot, I think, to raise the profile of gar as a group of fishes. Do you think that popularity is a result of gar just being under-celebrated and people becoming aware of them through your work and becoming excited because gar are in and of themselves such an interesting group of fishes, as we've talked about for the last 50 minutes? Or is it you being such an interesting person? Is it some combination of the two? How have you created this sphere of popularity around gar that I don't think existed 10, 15 years ago?
Well, thanks for those comments and compliments and the question, Casey. I like to think I can carry the torch for gars. So any interest in me, I like to, think that it's the fish who I'm speaking for. And somebody said that at a conference recently, we speak for the fish, as managers, as conservationists, as just fish enthusiasts, people that care about nature and biodiversity. So I think that's part of the mission when you're sort of speaking out for these darters, minnows, sturgeons, the freshwater biodiversity conservation of that sort of aspect of the biome, of the biosphere, lags far behind terrestrial conservation and marine conservation. So I think, it's part of the mission to conserve freshwater biodiversity because freshwater is our most valuable natural resource. So I look at that as part of the mission for it. With the science communication side of thing, I consider it a privilege to be able to talk about these fish and do it at least at times in an entertaining way. So for me, sometimes it's an outlet. Like I'm compelled. Like if a gar pun comes to mind, like I have to say it or I have to share it. Otherwise, something's probably going to glitch, in my brain somewhere. And it's been fun to see, on social media how people pick up with that and send me their gar puns. With Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, we've teamed up for Gar Week for the past several years, which has been neat because it's such a niche thing. So I think there's an appeal there. There's such weird fish. They've got that river monsters appeal that started back in I think 2009, and so it's sort of a weird animal, and people kind of like the weird stuff. You look at the blobfish, like who'd have ever thought that was popular? There's more blobfish plushies than there are gar plushies, so maybe that'll change someday. But I think it's a way to reach a more diverse audience too. So we publish in scientific journals and we give the presentations at conferences. But I think to reach a large contingent of the population that needs to care about this, we have to go to those other avenues. And social media is one of those. There's the people on Instagram and on TikTok, that you're going to reach, as opposed to the people that are reading the scientific journals or even reading magazines or watching the Animal Planet videos. So we have to have a diverse approach to conserve and protect diverse ecosystems.
How important is it to the conservation of gar, or just awareness of freshwater biodiversity, that you're not only reaching the public, which I think is at the root of why science communication is such an important aspect of the work that you're doing, that we're doing at the Tennessee Aquarium Conservation Institute. How important is it that you're not only reaching the public, but you're reaching young people? Because I think it is fair to say that if you look at social media, the audience tends to skew younger. You're reaching people at a fairly early stage in life before they're at a point where in their careers where they're making these decisions, but you're planting, I feel like, the seeds of these kinds of thoughts and these concerns that have a little bit more time to germinate and mature, so that by the time they do reach those positions of power and influence, they're already having those thoughts. How important do you think it is that you're hitting them now through social media?
Yeah, I think that's extremely important, Casey. I think I've given talks to K through 12 organizations. We did up in Maine, a couple different elementary schools, and it spun from like a department seminar at University of Maine to there's a couple elementary schools. It'd be great for you to chat with a couple classes. I'm like, sure. By the end of it, when I was there, it was 2 assemblies. I'd shipped 2 alligator gar heads over to Maine to use as examples. And we showed a bunch of cool videos to show these kids how cool these fish are, but representing, as Bernie does in his work, as Tenacity does, as the aquarium does, broader biodiversity, and like these habitats are important, and these are some cool animals that live in those habitats, and they're important for us to protect too. And that was everything from like gars going up for air to like gars are super slimy, especially when after they're dead and we're like bringing on them for dissection. So I had a video where I picked up a dead gar and slime just drips off it like a curtain, and all the kids are like, ew. And then so I told them about the reason that mucus is pretty important for protecting fish. And after I talked about the science a little bit, I told the kids, I'm like, who wants to see the slime video? Again, everyone raised their hand and stuff. And so I think reaching diverse audiences is extremely important to protect those diverse ecosystems. And like you said, plant the seed. For me, the way I got interested in gars was I had a Ranger Rick magazine when I was a kid that some neighborhood kids gave me. It was a back issue. I didn't have my own subscription. And I flipped to the middle of it and I saw this fish that looked like an alligator with fins instead of legs, and it was an alligator gar. And that stuck with me all the way to years later. I mean, I studied some other things along the way, but the gars came back, and now, that's what I studied, that's what I focus on, to use them as an example for broader freshwater biodiversity. I've had the opportunity to write for Ranger Rick and put an article there, so kind of coming full circle. So I think reaching that younger generation is extremely important, because they're the ones that are going to be around to deal with both the problems that we're making and hopefully the values that we're trying to instill.
Bernie, I want to loop you into this, because when we were talked before we started this conversation, again, talking about the parallels between you and Dr. David, one of the things that I've always loved about working with you, and one of the things I think helps the content that we produce through the aquarium and that we share with our audience on social media is the fact that you are both an incredibly accomplished scientist. You just know the subject so thoroughly, backward, forward, and at such a level of depth that you could easily fall into the trap that a lot of scientists do of just speaking in academies and not being able to communicate to the layperson at all. But you're able to communicate with people and to make these things that could be very difficult and dense very understandable. And I think one of the keys to that for both of you, just from this conversation, is your enthusiasm. There's not really a question here. Just I wanted you to kind of respond to the fact that you have this enthusiasm for these animals that, like Dr. David, are not very well celebrated, aren't very well known. And how do you see your role in through these pieces that we make in moving the needle of making people care about animals that they might not otherwise know about or care about?
Well, in the big picture, if you have someone in a monotone voice using really big words versus someone that's excited about what they study and using much smaller words, who are you going to pay attention to? It doesn't matter what the subject is or what the topic is. And so I think having not a fake, but a true excitement about what you study. And I've been studying freshwater fishes for over 40 years. Yes, I am old. And I still get excited going out to a nearby stream. And for the 100th time I've been in that stream, and for the 600th time I've collected the same fishes, and they still are so cool and so exciting. And that's the way to get people to know about what's in their backyard. And if you don't know about it, you can't protect it and you can't love it. So you've got to know what's there. You got to know what's hidden underneath the surface. Here in the Southeast, we've got that underwater rainforest, unrivaled biodiversity in the temperate world where the leaves fall off of the trees. And so the only way to protect it, the only way to keep this for future generations, the only way to keep our aquatic ecosystems healthy so humans can continue to be healthy and play in our rivers and streams is to understand how cool all this stuff is. And so just talk like a normal person and let your enthusiasm shine.
And the memes, you've got to capitalize on the memes. And Dr. David, I think you do an excellent job of just remaining completely on point when it comes to seeing a meme and making it work in the context of GAR and GAR study.
Thanks. I try to keep up with what I can, and I rely on my students and my kids. My wife's the director of development for the Bell Museum of Natural History, also at the U of M campus. And so we all have our resources there. So I have to credit a team with that. I would go back to, I echo everything that Bernie said, and especially like going out to the same stream, the same habitat. Like every time I see a gar, it's exciting to me. And I was able to take my students out there yesterday. I sent you all the pictures there, a young of the year gar, and we were like in the muck staining this up and stuff. But, the excitement from the team catching that one young of the year gar that had grown so much since the last time we were out there, it's contagious. And so I think, if people like Bernie and I are, excited about it, we hope that sort of enthusiasm is contagious to lead people to at least be curious and hopefully maybe even protect those systems. And I've got gars at home, gars in the lab, but anytime I see one, it's always very exciting. And I can appreciate that enthusiasm is shared by us for those organisms. And I hope that places like the aquarium, Tennessee Aquarium, like their freshwater exhibits, like I know the marine exhibit is amazing, but I was there for that conference. I visited the aquarium 3 times and spent all my time in the freshwater section. So what you all do for freshwater and more broadly for, aquatic biodiversity conservation is just amazing. So thank you for what you do. And it is still by far my favorite freshwater exhibits to go to. And I've been to a lot of aquariums, so.
I do want to start to wrap up this episode. I keep looking over at my timer, and I honestly still have so many questions written down that I wanted to ask, but I think we'll go ahead and start to wind things down a little bit. But I want to talk a little bit about the GarLab. We've talked about not knowing enough about GAR, and you're on the front lines of helping us to learn more about them. So What are you learning right now, and what are you excited to learn more about in the future?
Right. And I would say, Casey, it's been a privilege to be here at University of Minnesota and in the state of Minnesota because right now, Minnesota is really invested in conservation of these native non-game fish. And so that's something that's gained a lot of momentum over the past maybe 3, 4, 5 years, maybe, to where they're actually looking to protect those non-game native fish like the buffalo, the blue suckers, the freshwater drum, the gars, and the bowfin. And the legislature is supportive of that. The DNR is supportive of that. Fellow researchers are supportive of that. We've got anglers that are supportive of it. So it really is kind of a sweet spot for where there's a lot of support for these non-game native fishes and conservation. And the DNR put out the top three. They put out, I think, a list of maybe 16 priority native fish that they had data gaps for. And the top three in that list were long-nosed gar, short-nosed gar, and bowfin. I'm like, I can probably help out with a little bit of that stuff. So it's been a great fit and opportunity to work on these fish in a place where that work is supported by, groups all the way around when you think about broad stakeholders. And so that's been neat to kind of get out and try to start to answer some of those life history questions like Bernie alluded to, that we don't have basic early life history knowledge about a lot of these species. We don't have basic population dynamics knowledge about these fish. I like to say, like I said earlier, we might be 100 years behind what we know for walleye and largemouth bass, but it doesn't mean it needs to take us 100 years to catch up with that. We can use the knowledge, the models, the information that we know for those game fishes and apply them to the non-game fish, and then look to more broadly conserve freshwater biodiversity. So that's what I'm excited to be working on up here. So, I mean, the avenues are basically endless. I mean, there's at least 20 some species. I know not as much as we all have down there in Tennessee and Alabama, but as far as those non-game native fish, there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm glad to be part of a team that's working on it up here.
Awesome. And you mentioned earlier that the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation started this celebration of GAR a few years ago, GAR Week, which, if the stars align, looking at the publication schedule for this episode, it may end up going out during GAR Week. That would be that would be ideal. But what do you have planned when things are a little bit cooler in December to celebrate GAR Week?
Yeah, so we did December last year, just due to some scheduling things. It's typically in early November, so I can tell you that GAR Week will be the week of November 3rd through the 7th this year. So we'll be on with it. We just had a planning meeting with Oklahoma Wildlife just a couple days ago. So we've collaborated with them for several years. This year, we're kind of taking on more of a leadership role with that, still working with them. Their social media following is amazing and they do great work. So it's great to team up with them for that. But we're also working with a lot of other zoos, aquariums, nonprofit organizations. So we hope to have a lot of the GAR memes and puns going, but also focusing on conservation. One of the main themes we're looking at right now is sort of ethical angling involved with these native rough fish, these gars, bowfins, even the sturgeons. But then that more broad conservation and fun facts aspect of things. So we're planning on doing some things live, I believe. Maybe we can rope in Tennessee Aquarium for doing something as well. I think you all have done some of that in the past. So I believe we've got you on the hook for that. If we don't, it's in the podcast now. So,
I would be astonished if we didn't have some serious GAR representation on our social channels that week, or this week, again, if the stars align. So yeah, be sure that you follow the aquarium's various social channels. We're on pretty much all of them. But speaking of social, Dr. David, where can people find you on social and consume some of that GAR-related content that is obviously so popular?
Oh, thanks, Casey. So we're on Instagram. If you look up Solomon R. David or GarLab. So if you look up GarLab, you'll get to us one way or another. So we're across TikTok and Blue Sky and Twitter to an extent, and then definitely on Instagram. So if you look up GarLab, you'll be able to track us down.
Awesome. Bernie, can people find you on social anywhere? I'm not sure that I've ever asked you that.
Yeah, I look at social a lot, but I don't post because, the time that I post, I could be thinking about deeper thoughts about fishes. So I leave it up to you and your most excellent media team to be my social media presence.
All right. Well, I feel like we probably just scratched the surface of GAR as a topic of conversation, but we are past the point at which I would normally be ending the episode. So I will go ahead and wrap things up by saying thank you so much yet again to Dr. Solomon David. and Dr. Bernie Kuhajda for coming on to talk about living fossils and gar and sturgeon and bowfin and all these ancient cool fish that deserve more attention that we are doing our best to provide them.
Bernie, Casey, thank you for having me.
Hey, it was fun.
All right. If you have an idea for a future episode of the Podcast Aquatic, do send it along to podcast@tnaqua.org. While you're online, go ahead and write us a review or leave us a rating. Those are free and easy ways to support the show by giving us better play with the algorithm, which lets more people hear us. And in the meantime, until next time, remember that every drop matters.